Center, and I he doesn't, unless he really wants one, he doesn't need a long introduction. I'm just going to say he's a leader in energy policy in Washington State, in the Pacific Northwest, but Washington State in particular, and uh, uh, an important voice on just sanity and in how we approach energy in the state. And the author of a couple books. I will say I've only read one of them. I will get to the other two, but EcoFads was an excellent book. I recommend it to everyone, and was just kind of organizing my bookshelf for much in kind of an OCD way, and came across his book again, and had a chance to skim through it before today, and it reminded me the contribution that Todd makes to our public policy discussion in the state. And with that, we are going to talk about energy policy in Washington State. With that, Todd Myers.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about my book and my new book here in a second. But today, what I want to talk about is energy policy and sort of the state of energy policy in Washington State. And sort of where we are, what it means for natural gas. And then I'm happy to answer any questions. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the notes or in the comments. I can't, I can see the comments. There they are.
Yeah,
so yeah,
as you're going, Todd, I'll maybe interrupt you here and there and call out a question if someone puts it in there.
All right. Well, very good. As he said, I'm Todd Myers. I'm the environmental director at the Washington Policy Center. I've been working on environmental policy for almost 25 years in Washington State. I used to have a beautiful head of hair when I started working in environmental policy. Now I drink more and have less hair. But it's interesting, and there's a lot going on here, and it's sort of the curse. May you live in interesting times. The curse for me is may you live in an interesting state for environment. So what the Washington Policy Center does is that we are a public policy market-oriented think tank, and we have experts in several areas. So if you go to our webpage, washingtonpolicy.org, this is sort of what you'll see. We have experts on environment, transportation, healthcare, small business, budget and transparency, agriculture, and education. And we write primarily on state issues, but some local and some national, with a market focus, because we believe that innovation in the market is the best way to solve lots of problems in a way that is consistent with personal freedom and prosperity. And while a lot of people believe that energy and the environment and prosperity are at odds, that simply isn't true. And in fact, we find that the best environmental solutions often come from people in business who are innovating and finding ways to do more with less. That, however, is not what Washington State government or our politicians believe. And as a result, we have adopted a number of new energy and climate policies in recent years to address climate change and to reduce CO2 emissions. So this year, as you probably are aware, Washington is started implementing what's called the Climate Commitment Act, which is a cap on total CO2 emissions. It's what's typically called a cap and trade system. So they have a cap on emissions, and then you have to emitters, which are primarily fuel industries, natural gas, gasoline, diesel, propane, and then utilities and a few other folks have to buy allowances for every metric ton of CO2 that they produce. And then if they reduce emissions more than expected, they can trade the permits that they have purchased There are ways to generate a small amount of permits that can be sold, but that's the trade. But the fundamental thing is that it sets a cap on total statewide CO2 emissions. And so you can see here that in 2020, there was a limit set in law. We have to go 45% below the 2020 target by 2030, and then to 95% below 1990 levels by 2050. So that 95% seems very aggressive, and it of course is, but really I think that the bigger problem we're going to have is meeting that 2030 target, which is 45% below the 1990 levels by 2030, because we are way above 1990 levels. 2020, they still haven't released the 2020 emissions data, but my guess is, based on the numbers, it's going to be very close to the 1990 levels. So even with the COVID shutdown, we barely met or maybe even missed those targets. And then, of course, emissions rebounded in 2021 and probably 2022. So the amount that we're going to have to cut by 2030 is going to be very aggressive, very fast, which is why you have seen prices going up so much. But we'll talk about that in a second. There are basically two goals of the Climate Commitment Act. The one you hear about all the time is to reduce CO2 emissions, but it is far from the only goal. I would say in some cases, the primary goal is actually to generate tax revenue, because a lot of the things that are included in the Climate Commitment Act are more about generating tax revenue to the state than they are about cutting emissions. But those are the two goals. That's the way it's structured. So the question is that we've had this since January 1st. And what has been the impact on prices? Now, we focus primarily on gasoline because that's what everybody sees on every street corner. But as I said, it impacts all emitting fuels, including natural gas. So when the law was passed, Governor Inslee at the signing ceremony actually said, "Don't believe that swill that this is going to increase prices." This, of course, is a silly claim, because the purpose of a cap and trade system, of any tax on CO2 emissions, is to increase the price, to provide an incentive to switch either to electricity or electric vehicles or other things like that, away from carbon emitting fuels. So the notion that you would increase taxes and increase the price of CO2 emissions and it wouldn't increase the price of fuels is ridiculous. Ecology, however, for whatever reason, decided to sort of stick with this claim. And in a letter to the state legislature last July of 2022, actually said that gas prices would only go up by about 1%. And it said if it's about $5 a gallon, that would translate into additional 5 cents per gallon in 2023. Those are their words. This is, of course, ridiculous, because their own there is a minimum price, and the minimum price is $22 a metric ton for allowances under the system, which translates to 17 cents a gallon. So even if the permits sold for a minimum, they would still be 17 cents a gallon. So the 5 cent a gallon claim was always silly, but that wasn't the silliest claim. The silliest claim was that the price of natural gas would decrease by about 1%. It is unclear to me how you increase taxes on a product and the price goes down. But the Department of Ecology felt confident enough in that claim that they literally put it in a letter. So now that we have had experience and we have seen the prices of gasoline go up and we have seen the prices of natural gas go up, the same state senator, Shelley Short, sent a letter to Ecology again and said, "Okay, we've had some experience. Do you stand by your estimates?" And what they did is that they did a couple of things. First, Ecology's webpage used to have these price projections. They scrubbed all of those price projections from their webpage. So you can't find them anymore because they realized that they were wrong. Now they sort of have play word games. And what you can see is from the letter and below, it says, The data indicates when you compare Washington gasoline prices to Oregon gasoline prices, that a large majority of the increase in Washington prices cannot be attributed to the Cap and Invest program. Okay, that's true. There are lots of things that influence gas prices. What they're saying is, we didn't start the fire, we just threw gasoline on it. we drove costs up. And so that is sort of the game, that is the political game that is being played with this right now. And the unfortunate thing about their willingness to continue to play this game is that it means that relief from these very high costs is very unlikely. But let me show you the real world impact that this is happening in a couple of areas. First, let's look at gasoline. So I mentioned comparing to Oregon. So this goes back 1 year. I just pulled this down yesterday. And what you can see is that prior to January 1st, when Washington's law took effect, Washington and Oregon's average prices, according to GasBuddy, were virtually identical. You can go to AAA and find the same thing. But our prices were slightly different, but basically identical. But then what you start to see is January 1st, you immediately start to see this divergence. And the divergence is, for a long time, almost identical to the price that would be imposed from the carbon tax. So the way that the price works is that it's unlike a traditional gas tax where you just set a price per gallon, or a traditional carbon tax where you set a price per metric ton. Under a cap and trade system, there is an auction. So there's a limited number of permits that are available. And then based on demand, those are auctioned off. So the price fluctuates. And what you see is that the difference between Oregon and Washington's prices gets wider and narrower. It basically follows, but you can see that that gap represents the cost. Right now, the difference is about 37 cents a gallon. That's actually less than the implied cost based on the cost of the cap and trade system. The most recent auction was $63.01, which would imply a 49.9 cent per gallon tax. It's a little more complicated than that because there are also private markets where people can buy futures or buy existing credits from people who have purchased options. There's also an offset market. So there's a variety of ways to get the allowances that fuel suppliers need to comply with the law. So it's not a perfect translation one-to-one in terms of costs. And you can see that here, like I said, if you were just looking at the price, it would be about 50 cents a gallon, but we actually see at the pump, it's 37 cents a gallon. 37 cents a gallon, however, is not 5 cents and it's not 0 cents. We are seeing an impact. And again, that's not an accident. That is the intent of the law, which is to drive up costs. The same is true for natural gas. So as you remember, the Department of Ecology actually said that the price of natural gas would go down by 1% in 2023. Well, the State Utilities Commission disagrees. So Puget Sound Energy applied to the Utilities Commission to increase their natural gas rates for residential home heating customers. And the Utilities Commission approved that cost increase. And so what they say here is that costs would be recovered through a proposed state carbon reduction charge, which equals the projected amount of costs of allowances, these carbon allowances sold at auction, PSE needs to comply with the Cap and Invest program. So there, the Utilities Commission is specifically saying, yes, Puget Sound Energy, you can have what amounts to about a 3% rate increase to cover the costs of complying with cap and trade, specifically contradicting the prediction that Ecology made that prices would go down. But it actually gets even worse than that, is that the Utilities Commission said, don't tell anyone. So the Attorney General's office has an office, what do they call the Public Counsel. So because there's private financial information involved in rate setting, there is somebody in the Attorney General's office who can look at that private financial information that is part of rate cases and is supposed to represent the public. So if in a rate case, I wanted to participate, I couldn't look at those documents. The public counsel in the Attorney General's office can. That's what their job is. Despite that responsibility to represent the public counsel in the Attorney General's office actually recommended that Puget Sound Energy be prohibited from listing the cost of the new tax on CO2 emissions on customer bills. Puget Sound Energy had asked to add a line item showing what it was for. The Attorney General, the person in the Attorney General's office said, we recommend against that, arguing that adding a line item would be too confusing for customers. They wouldn't know what it is. So the Utilities Commission said, yes, we agree with the Attorney General's office. We will prohibit PSE from showing that is a cost. But it gets better. For low-income customers, the utilities are required to basically waive that additional cost, give low-income customers a credit that covers the cost of compliance with the tax on CO2 emissions. After saying that adding a line item would be too confusing for customers, the Utilities Commission then turned around and mandated that Puget Sound Energy add that line item, showing that the customer got a credit to offset the increase. So what some customers are now going to get is a bill that shows a credit, but will not show the cost that credit covers. I mean, if they're worried about being confusing, they have created a system that is intentionally going to confuse people, because people are going to think that their bills have been reduced when in fact their bills have not been changed at all. So that's sort of the games that are getting played with the costs of the Climate Commitment Act. So just to put this in perspective, how much is this all costing? So Washington, at the most recent auction, there are quarterly auctions, and then there is essentially a circuit breaker. If costs go above a certain amount per metric ton, there's a special auction that is added to put more credits on the market, basically just supply and demand, increasing the supply of allowances so that hopefully prices go down. So after the second auction that we had, we eclipsed that market price. We eclipsed the circuit breaker. So they had a special auction. We just had the third auction in August, I think. I can't remember the dates. And we again broke the cap. And so now they're adding another special auction. So at that third quarterly auction, the price was $63.03 per metric ton of CO2. As I said, that's equivalent to about 50 cents per gallon of gas. I calculated it. It's about 33 cents, I think, per therm, to give you a sense of what the cost is there. Now, to put this in context, there is also a market in California and Quebec. They have a similar system. Their most recent price is $35.30. So Washington, that should say that Washington is 79% higher than California. So Washington State's carbon price is the highest in the Americas. And the problem is that while we pay about 80% more than California and Quebec, we don't get any more CO2 reductions. We don't get anything more than that. We just get more money to the state government. And there was an article about it in the Seattle Times, and this quote is from James Bushnell, who is a professor in the Department of Economics at University of California, Davis. They have had this cap and trade system for a decade. And I love this quote. He says, the idea is, yes, we want to try to cap emissions, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for customers in one state to pay outrageously more than anyone else to reduce carbon emissions of just that one state. And that is, in fact, the situation that we are facing right now. So the question that was just asked, which is, where does that money go? That's a good question. So the original estimate for the amount of money that would be generated by this system was about between 460 and 480 million dollars per year. Thus far, Washington State, and remember, we are only through 3 quarters, has generated $1.4 billion in revenue. So again, the original estimate in the fiscal note when they did the budget was about 460 or 480 million. We're now at about 1.4 billion. So what the legislature did was they passed a budget that assumed that $460 million amount, but now they're trying to figure out what to do with the rest of it. But I will tell you what they have done so far with the original funding. So I went through the budget and categorized the expenditures from this in the operations budget in a number of different categories. And like I said, they budgeted about 475 million. Less than half of that goes to grants that actually reduce CO2 emissions or are designed to deal with the impacts of climate change. More than half of it goes to various government programs, such as helping with siting of wind turbines, solar panels, renewable energy. A big chunk is that orange chunk, which is for planning. So we also passed a law that requires local communities to add climate change to their planning. The state passed along a huge amount of money to them to help them with that planning. So a big chunk goes there. Permitting is that gray. So rather than reduce the difficulty of permitting, they just added more money so that people could, so that government could deal with the permits rather than, make it less expensive. Increases in staff, other implementation, miscellaneous, all of those are for various government programs. So as I said, more than half of the money thus far that has been budgeted goes to various government expansion, either at the state or local level. Now, as you can tell, they're going to have more than $1 billion of new revenue to play with. And in the next legislative session in January, my guess is that they will start to figure out how to spend all of that. The governor and other groups are already lobbying very hard to spend every dime of it. There was a question asked about whether there could be a cut in taxes, either some other taxes or a cap could be put on the prices. As I noted, we are about 80% higher than California's prices. And so Senator Mark Mullet proposed something at the end of the session, which didn't pass, when it was clear that the prices were going to be very high, that would basically tie our prices to California's, basically creating a flat price, and that bill went nowhere. So my guess is that we probably won't see relief in terms of the system itself. The other thing that we are facing is that because we keep breaking the price caps on the auctions, and we keep having these special auctions to inject more credits to try to drive the price down, those credits aren't free. They don't just come from the sky. They are pulled forward from future years so that the cap that I showed you earlier still exists. We're not adding credits above the cap. We are taking credits from the future and moving them forward. So while that may provide some cost relief now, it makes future targets more difficult to hit, so it drives up prices in the future. And based on the estimates from the Department of Ecology, the costs of compliance, the cost of the permits, will continue to go up through 2030. And they actually expect it to go over $100 a metric ton, which is 80 something cents, like 89 cents a gallon, I think it is. So to give you a sort of perspective on that. So that's what's happening in Washington State with cap and trade and our carbon policy. I just want to finish by saying that now we are getting, what they're doing is that you're also seeing not just the CCA, but you're also seeing Building Code Council rules. So one of the things that's great about cap and trade, amongst all its problems, is that it is comprehensive. It is a single program that eliminates the needs for all sorts of ad hoc policies. Previously, what we would do is we would subsidize this and put a regulation on that. And we'd hope that the combination of all of those subsidies and regulations would reduce CO2 emissions. What cap and trade does is it says, look, we don't care how you reduce CO2 emissions, just do it. As long as we can meet the cap, that's great. Do whatever you can. Nobody seemed to give that message to various state agencies, regulatory bodies, and politicians, because even though we have this comprehensive system, we are still adding more regulations on top of that. So the Building Code Council is one of those. So the Building Code Council obviously is looking to ban natural gas hookups for new homes. It actually passed a regulation that did that. That was overturned, not Washington's rule, but a similar rule in Berkeley, California was overturned by the Ninth Circuit. So the State Building Code Council realized that their rule, I should say, not law, was in jeopardy as well. So they made a change and they went to a point system. But of course, the point system is created so it's basically impossible or extremely expensive to have natural gas hookups to homes. Now, the thing about this is that it doesn't actually reduce any CO2 emissions. If this rule had never been passed, Washington would still have to meet the exact same CO2 emission caps. So with or without the Building Code Council, we are required by law to meet that, because only a certain number of CO2 allowances will be put up for sale. All the Building Code Council regulation does is say, we want you to meet the cap, but we want you to do it in this very specific, more expensive way. So this doesn't add environmental benefit, it just adds cost. And the plain reason is that regulatory agencies and others want to feel like they're contributing, want to feel like they're helping. And the person at the Building Code Council who proposed this works at an organization whose goal is to decarbonize buildings, right? So they want to get in on the action. So that's the problem, is that we have a system, and I think that there are some problems with the cap and trade system, but fundamentally cap and trade systems are a good way to meet environmental goals. We've done it with sulfur dioxide and acid rain. We do it with fisheries to reduce overfishing. It could work for CO2 emissions, but it only works if you don't also do all of the costly regulatory and subsidies that exist out there. And in Washington State, we are doing that. And natural gas, in particular, natural gas home heating, is a target of that from the Building Code Council. So the question is, what can we do instead? People say, okay, Todd, you're so smart. You care about the environment. You're very critical of this, what we can do. And what I argue is that it's time to democratize environmentalism rather than have top-down regulation, bottom-up technology that allows people to conserve and save energy and save money in a way that's more effective. I will skip this real quick. I will just tell the story very quickly, which is that one great example is ocean plastic. That people, basically everybody's worried about too much plastic going into the ocean. But as you can see on this map, the places that plastic is going into the ocean are not the United States. They're primarily developing countries. And so how do you deal with a problem like that? You can only deal with it at sort of the ground level. And so a group called Plastic Bank, actually using small technologies, just basically cell phones and a web page, pays people to pick up plastic off of beaches that would otherwise wash into the ocean, pays them on their cell phones, tracks it on a web page so that you can see where the plastic has come from. And the next time you go to the store and buy Windex, you will see a little sticker on that that says made with ocean-bound plastic. This is a very simple bottom-up solution, right? There's the technology is very easy. It's not complicated. It's being done in places where governments are either uninterested or just simply not strong enough to be interested. But this graphic I pulled from this week, you can see down the bottom it says 101 million kilograms of plastic, and a kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. So 220 million pounds of plastic that would have washed into the ocean has been collected using this simple method. This is the way that we can solve really big problems more effectively and at a lot less cost. And so this is what my book is about. It is about ways that we can solve environmental problems in a way that doesn't sort of do top-down imposing regulations that are very expensive, that don't even achieve often their environmental goals, but empower
Hey, before you dig into that, can you answer Darren Anderson has a question? Are Washington utilities getting free allowances to cover their compliance obligations?
Oh yeah, I didn't see that. Sorry. Yes. So yes and no. Washington utilities are getting free allowances, but they are required to use those allowances for the benefit of their customers. And in the case of Puget Sound Energy, what the Utilities Commission actually ruled was that Puget Sound Energy had to eat some of the cost of those allowances, couldn't pass on all of the cost to customers as a way to try to force Puget Sound Energy to decarbonize. Again, this is a really weird thing because we have to reduce CO2 emissions anyway. So it's not like Puget Sound Energy, there is a requirement that they have to decarbonize. So, raising the cost for Puget Sound Energy, they're legally obliged to do it. So it's sort of, a duplicate. You add costs, but for no additional reason. So utilities do get free credits, but there are lots of restrictions on how they can use those credits. And then the other group that gets free credits are what are called energy intensive trade exposed industries. So concrete, aluminum, oil refineries, ironically, all get free credits in the first compliance period to cover their obligations. And then the amount of credits they get declines over time to encourage them to become more energy efficient. The goal there is to reduce the cost impact on those industries so they don't just simply pick up and move to China or another part of the United States, where they would emit the same or more CO2 emissions. Wouldn't be a benefit to the planet, it would just lose us jobs. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Do you see any legislation in the coming sessions to modify the Climate Commitment Act? Are there, in the early implementation, are there obvious problems besides the obvious problem of its existence, I guess, to make it more efficient, easier to implement, whatever?
I doubt the more efficient, easier to implement. There is, in the existing Climate Commitment Act, there is a requirement that agricultural uses are exempt. The Department of Ecology, however, did not write rules to implement that. So if you are a fuel supplier and you sell diesel to, farmers and other folks, there is no mechanism to say these gallons of gas or these gallons of diesel were sold to farmers and therefore are, I don't need allowances for them. You could say that. Whether the Department of Ecology recognizes that is the question. And the Department of Ecology has not said, here is the way that you can prove that to us so that we know that you are still in compliance, even though you're not buying allowances to cover those. So that's a problem. There are negotiations about how to do that now. There is some word that they've come to an agreement, but I haven't seen it yet. So if that doesn't get solved, you may see some push by legislators to make that clear. Puget Sound Energy pushed a bill last year that would basically have the state pay them to switch more rapidly off of natural gas and electrify. That bill didn't go anywhere, but I expect that to be back. I don't know if other utilities, other investor-owned utilities like Avista will join them on that. They didn't last time. So you're likely to see something like that. What you're more likely to see is efforts by politicians to hide the costs of the tax on CO2 emissions. So last session, Senator Wynn, who is the chair of the Energy and Environment Committee, had a bill that would make it illegal for fuel suppliers to list a line item that said, here's how much the Climate Commitment Act is adding to the price of diesel and gasoline, things like that. It also applies certainly to natural gas. That bill didn't go anywhere because it was introduced late. However, the governor, Senator Wynn, and others are promising to pass a law that investigates what they call price gouging by oil companies. They're blaming the increase in prices, the graph that I showed you between Washington and Oregon, on oil company greed. They have not explained why oil company greed stops at Washington state border and doesn't bleed into Oregon, but they want to pass a law that would do an investigation and mandate that oil companies turn over all sorts of financial records so that they could go through and find evidence of oil company greed. I think that's what they're going to do, rather than make compliance less expensive or easier, is that they're probably going to just try to find ways to blame it on the costs on oil companies or other folks.
Yep, that'll fix it. Darren Anderson has a question, another question. It seems to me that the real payers or losers in this equation are utilities with customer bases outside of Washington. They'll end up footing the majority of this cost increase in power and gas prices. Does that make sense to you?
I don't think so, because gas outside the state, there may be some nuance that I'm not understanding, but gas and electricity outside the state is exempt, and there are rules about sort of what gets counted and what doesn't. You see that in the discrepancy between Washington and Oregon in gas prices. I have talked with people who say that there is, at the borders, that there are games that are getting played where Washington buyers are trying to limit their costs, and so therefore, I mean, maybe that gets at what the question is that part of the cost is being passed on at the borders because Washington state companies are trying to find ways to get non-taxed fuel outside the state. I think that's probably pretty limited, but that could be going on. But I don't have a good answer on that.
Darren, you're welcome to turn on your microphone if you want to expand on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Sorry about that. I didn't know.
Yeah, we can hear you.
No, I'm talking about the forward price curves. They have this embedded carbon cost allowance included in them. So basically, when you go out and you hedge something between now and 2026, we saw a distinct paradigm shift in the pricing curves in the forward market. So utilities that use these prices for hedging purposes to protect their ratepayers had to pay this essential, $50, $60 embedded price. So when we fixed that price, our price went from, say, $30 to $55. Well, our customers feel real good knowing they had $55, but they had to pay $55 instead of $30 because of this because of this legislation that passed. So
Hmm.
that cost gets passed on to those ratepayers outside the state of Washington, and they're the real losers in this. That's my point. Sorry, I was trying to type it, but I wasn't being very clear.
Yeah.
And so you see that not only in the price of power at Mid-C, you also see it in the price of gas, not gasoline, but natural gas coming in the Sumas and those trading hubs. And so this paradigm shift is there, and it will continue to be there until this legislation is right-sized and actually put back on the folks in the state of Washington who actually put the policy in place and elected the officials that did it.
Yeah, the other issue I mean, like the impact on the utilities is very difficult. I mean, I've talked with many of them, and it gets very complex very fast because we also have CETA, which is the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which requires utilities to be carbon net neutral by 2030, and then neutral by 2045, or zero carbon by 2045. And so that like lays on top of this as well. So I am not an expert in the interplay of all of those things and how that plays out in the real world. But and then the other issue, of course, that I've talked with plenty of utilities, especially public utilities, who buy some on the spot market, which is that the duck curve from California, right? Their shortages are moving north as well and having an impact on us. So how all of these various laws, subsidies play together is becoming increasingly complex. And I think what you've just talked about is one example.
Thanks, Todd. It's a great presentation. I appreciate the content. Very real, very to point.
Yeah, agreed. Is any other questions? We're starting to bump up against our hour. Last questions. Well, seeing none, hearing none. Todd, thank you very much. I agree with what Darren just said. Appreciate it. And we'll have this this presentation will be put onto the Gas Association's YouTube channel, so people can view it later or share it with others later. And but I think that's it. Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, let me just add one last thing, which
Sure.
is